So again, good morning. I'm going to call this work session into order. I understand that we do not have 7 board members yet, but we have a lot to cover. And since this first part of work session is just a presentation, that we're going to go ahead and start. We do have approximately, according to our timeline, 90 minutes to hear all the presentations. There are 4 different parts of the presentation. We have set aside a lot of time for today's presentations and discussion after lunch. However, since there is a lot to cover, what I want to do is, board members holding off on their questions on the presentations until all the presentations are done first, unless you really have a very urgent, important, clarifying questions on presentations. Otherwise, we're going to let Dr. Duran to introduce other people at the head of the table for the presentations, and then let us know what your expectation from this work session is, and continue on with your presentations.
Thank you, Mr. Moon, and good morning, board members. So today we have a very extensive and detailed overview discussion and information around some really exciting work that's been done, and we really are looking forward to presenting that information to you. So as Mr. Moon said, it is going to be in 4 parts, which I'll talk about more specifically in a moment. But just as a little bit of background information, the discipline system and equity study that has been conducted and is being presented today as a result of an ask of the board about a year ago to dive much deeper into looking at our discipline trends, our hearing office staffing needs, which we presented in phase 1, disproportionality trend, which we'll be talking about today, outcomes of discipline involved students, which we'll be talking about today, and then most importantly, what are some practices designed to reduce behavioral issues that we could put in place to make a difference and have positive outcomes for students. So as you'll see on the graphic, you've seen this before probably, today's focus is looking at, understanding, and hearing the results of 3 main studies that were done. The first was done by Orsi, and it is focused on student behavior, discipline, and disproportionality. And really want to thank Leedy and her team, Michelle Farrer, who's in the audience, and Eva Corkin. I'm not sure if she's here, but I want to thank her as well. They really spent an extensive amount of time studying, and you'll be hearing in a moment from Leedy their findings. We also have a study that was done, external study on equity and disproportionality, done by Temple University and Dr. Fergus, who unfortunately couldn't be here today because we had to change the work session from last Monday to today, but he did provide a detailed report, and I will be giving some highlights of that when we get to that portion of the presentation. And then last, we have Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo, who are here with us, and they did a review on our policies and practices. So you'll be hearing the 3 of those reports. Culminating after hearing those 3 reports will be an overview of my recommendations from an equity lens around some different policy practices and future considerations for us to think about moving forward. There will be no ask for action in this portion of the work session. It's future discussions and decisions that need to come. One will be coming very quickly because a part of that is our SR&R, which follows today. And then there are additional things that we will be recommending and needing to have much deeper dialogue and discussion on. So that's our outcome today, is informational, understanding, and then also clarifying questions you may have so that we can really roll up our sleeves and begin to make some shifts, decisions, and actionable next steps for what needs to occur to reduce disproportionality and discipline in our system. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first presentation, and that is Leedy, who will be presenting the findings from our internal review by Orsi.
So good morning. I'm going to start off with a little bit of context around the information that you're going to be seeing today. And this is around what happens when a student misbehaves. You'll see on this slide the kinds of places where staff in the school division make decisions, and then even places where the school board makes decisions. Starting on the left, when a student first misbehaves, the staff member can decide whether to handle it themselves with something like maybe redirecting the student or doing something in the classroom typically, or they can refer the student to the office. And at that point, the principal needs to make a decision on whether to handle the misbehavior in school with something like an in-school suspension, a detention, a call to the parent, or an out-of-school suspension, or alternately refer that student to the superintendent, which leads to a hearing. Then the hearings office also makes a decision around what might happen to the student if the student is referred to them. And then ultimately, parents can appeal that decision to the school board for a final decision. Now, you'll see on here as well that research supports that certain kinds of decisions are more positive for students. So when the decisions reflect a positive approach that helps students learn from the experience rather than punishment or exclusion from learning, they tend to have better outcomes. And so that is kind of the foundation for what we're going to look at today in looking at all of the discipline, disproportionality, as well as the outcomes for our students. On this slide, you'll see all the different data collection that ORSI undertook to support the data that you'll be hearing about today. We, of course, used available discipline data that we have in the system, as well as achievement and attendance data and all other kinds of outcome data for students. But we collected our own data as well, and you'll see the very many different stakeholders that we asked to participate in it. We had almost 28,000 parents complete a survey. We had many respondents and students at schools do it as well. And you'll see that we did both surveys, interviews, as well as focus groups. And we conducted 19 focus groups in order to understand really what stakeholders were feeling and what students and families were experiencing around the discipline process. And this was different from some of the past work that ORSI has been able to undertake in this area. We also want to really thank all of the respondents, everyone who participated in our focus groups and our interviews, to really help us understand what their experiences were, both on the side of staff as well as on the side of our families and our community. So what are the trends in student behavior, discipline, and disproportionality in our schools? Some of this you've seen before, but I'm going to try to walk us through the different parts of it. The main takeaways here are that 7 to 8% of our students are involved in documented discipline referrals each year. If you think back on that chart that I just showed you, teachers often handle misbehavior on their own and things don't get documented. But we do document some of the discipline referrals in our student information system, and about 7 to 8% of our students end up each year having documented discipline referrals. In addition, you'll see that there's been increases in VDOE reported discipline involvement, and some of that is partially due to changes in VDOE changing their own requirements for what gets reported, and some of it is due to increases in the referrals themselves. Thirdly, there's been increases in the percentages of students that are referred and involved in exclusionary practices, meaning that the decisions that staff are making or that principals are making around whether or not to have students excluded from discipline with things like an out-of-school suspension are on the rise. And then lastly, that we've had consistent disproportionality for some of our students across many years, and especially for our Black, our students with disabilities, our students who are economically disadvantaged, and our male students. On this chart, you get a sense of what the scope is in terms of who's involved in discipline and how that's breaking out across the different kinds of discipline involvement. Here you see the 7 to 8%. In 2017-18, it was actually 7.7% of our students who had documented discipline referrals in SIS. And then a subset of those were considered VDOE reported. So every year, the VDOE asks us to report certain kinds of violations that students commit, as well as students who are in school suspended or out of school suspended to them so that they're aware of that. And about 3.6% of our students, that subset of the 7.7, had to be reported to VDOE. And then a subset of those, 0.3% of our students, have to also be involved in the hearings process. And those numbers, most of them, other than VDOE, have been pretty steady across the years. Here you'll see FCPS's discipline-involved students over time. This is something that comes from the state, and they actually select a subpart of the ones that get reported to them to provide this data. And you'll see that the gray line on top is the average in the state, which is about 6% of students. And the blue line at the bottom is FCPS, and we have about 2%, but it is rising. And so you'll see that we have about a third of what's happening in the state in terms of the percent of our students who are committing these kinds of violations and discipline involved. But nonetheless, our discipline involvement is increasing over time. Now I'm going to talk about the different kinds of discipline involvement and help you understand a little bit about some rule changes that VDOE has put in place since 2015-16. So the chart on the left is everyone that we have had to report to VDOE over the last 7 years. You'll see that the dot for 18-19 are the students for half a year, because at the time we analyzed this data, we only had the first half of this school year to report on. So we've kind of separated it so that we don't necessarily have the full year to compare it to. You'll see that up until 2015-16, we were having slow decreases in the percent of students, and then all of a sudden in 2016-17, there was a sharp increase, and that continued in 17-18. A lot of that sharp increase was due to the fact that VDOE asked that all students who were receiving in-school suspensions be reported to them. In the past, general education students who had received in-school suspensions were not required to be reported unless they had committed a specific violation that was reportable. So part of the increase is due to that change in their reporting requirements. And you can see on the right side, if that change had not happened, there would still have been an increase. So some of the increase is due to actual increases in our referrals as well. And you'll see on a later slide that part of it is also due to increases in our in-school suspensions. Now I'm moving on to slide 12, and I'll be talking more in depth about certain subgroups of students so you can see some information about them as well. Here, if you look at the last 3 years, you'll see a slowly increasing percent of our students who were students with disabilities that have been involved in VDOE reported violations. And this is true not only overall in the division, but you generally see that same pattern of increases across time at each of our school levels, with the sharpest increase happening at our middle school level, and the highest number of students also at the middle school level. Moving on to consequences, or the decisions that staff are making, here you see that over the last 3 years, we've also had increasing numbers of not just in-school suspensions, but also out-of-school suspensions. So students being removed from their regular instruction is on the rise in FCPS. Now I'll start talking about disproportionality in FCPS. And on this first slide, I want to spend a little bit of time explaining how these slides are set up and how to read them. So when you look at this slide, if everyone in FCPS was proportional in terms of how discipline was being assigned, you would have levels for all the subgroups that were right around 1. And the gray bar kind of shows where students in general are supposed to be in order for no actions to have to be made. So if you're within that gray bar area, typically an organization or a school division does not have to take actions, but once you're outside that area, typically it's recommended that actions address the disproportionality. You can see in this slide where we're looking at students with disabilities that they're about 3.5 times as likely to be suspended as other students in the school division. This is also true for our Black students, our economically disadvantaged students, and our males as well. They're each 3 or more times as likely to be in the VDOE violation as other students. Moving on to looking at ethnic disproportionality, on the left, you will see a slide that shows you, or a graph that shows you, what the disproportionality is when you're only looking at weapons violations. These are often considered more objective of violations and are not as prone to be influenced by any kind of biases or subjectivity that staff who are making decisions might have. And then on the right side, you have drugs and alcohol that are also considered relatively objective violations. You'll see here that our Black student subgroup is typically in the VDOE database at about twice as often as our remaining students. Now I'm moving on to two other kinds of violations, which are our assaults and our disruptive behaviors. These tend to be seen in the literature as more subjective violations, and you will see that the Black subgroup is almost 3 times as likely. So there's an increase, especially for the Black students. It grows larger in terms of disproportionality as we move to these more subjective types of violations. So what explains the student behavior, discipline, and disproportionality data that we were just looking at? First of all, FCPS has some strengths that may be helping to support more positive outcomes. The first is that we're moving towards a multi-tiered system of supports that unifies academics, behavior, and wellness outcomes for our students. You heard a lot about this on Thursday during the Goal 2 presentation, and we've been piloting MTSS in 5 of our schools to help combine all 3 of those areas. And over the last 3 years, we've also had a variety of staff from many of our schools participate in MTSS training. During the 2019-20 school year, it's expected that all schools will self-assess on their readiness for MTSS, and that by 2020, they will be implementing the plan that they develop following that readiness assessment. Another strength for FCPS is around administrators and their assignment or their decisions that they make about whether or not to suspend students. On the left, you see the same information that I showed you earlier for students who are referred for a violation around weapons. You see that same disproportionality of about 2 times as often for our Black students, and where our Hispanic students are kind of fluctuating between about 1.5 and 2 times as likely to be referred. On the right side, amongst those students who were referred for a discipline violation related to weapons, there is no disproportionality in terms of the decisions our principals are making in whether or not to suspend the students or remove them from the regular instruction. So on the right side there is the strength that we are being equitable in how our principals are making decisions, at least when it comes to suspensions. Moving on to the more subjective violation type, and here we're looking at disruptive behaviors. For disruptive behaviors, again, on the left is the slide you saw previously where students were 3 times as likely if they were Black to be suspended. To be involved in that kind of violation. And on the right side, you see that principals are still relatively equitable in whether or not they are assigning suspension to students. So the summary here is that it is the staff suspensions on the way in that are causing it, as opposed to the decisions that principals are making once they have a student in front of them committing the violation. Now on to challenges. The first area that I'm going to focus in on today is around division expectations. What is the division asking staff and schools to do? And one of the things you'll hear, not just in this report, but I think in both of the consultant reports as well, is that FCPS does not do a good job of communicating a clear vision. In reviewing all the documents that exist and the website, ORCE was unable to yield any kind of consistent vision for that discipline, and our school-based staff focus groups also supported that staff are unsure of what the vision is or think that SR&R itself captures it. I want to comment on the quotes that you'll see in some of this section. These come from our focus groups, our interviews, or our open-ended survey items. And although they are just individual things that our respondents provided to us, they represent the themes that came out. So even though it's one person saying them, we had very, very consistent themes that came out of all of our qualitative data. And so these are there to help support an understanding of what those themes were. Moving on to the next challenge, the SRNR does not convey FCPS's desire to create a positive school climate or use discipline as an opportunity for learning. Our central office interviews indicated that FCPS is very focused on and committed to creating a positive school climate and using a positive discipline approach. Unfortunately, our content analysis of discipline-related documents in the school division found that there was really a focus primarily on punitive consequences, not on positive behavior approaches, and there was only surface-level attention paid to coverage of a positive behavior approach. In fact, we could only track down 2 sentences in the full SRNR regulation that spoke to a positive behavior approach. Now, later on, AIR will also be talking a little bit about our SRNR document for families, where we do have a lot more information and it's more explanatory of some of these other things. But our regulation itself is pretty limited in its reflection of a positive behavior approach. Moving on to school practices. Staff interpretations of student behavior drive disproportionality in discipline referrals. You saw that when we were looking at the data that showed that our principals are pretty equitable in what they do, but on the staff side, in terms of the students being referred, there is differences or disproportionality in who is referred. Our principal and teacher focus groups also indicated that challenges stem from a lack of knowledge or interpreting and responding to behavior. And one of the quotes is, "Sometimes when we're coming from different backgrounds, a lot of this ends up happening. Referrals may be due to different backgrounds and not being able to understand. At our school, it's a lot of special education students who get referrals, African American boys." So for example, teachers sometimes, if they're dealing with a student with a disability, may not be understanding what's frustrating that student, not understand how to de-escalate the situation, and ultimately, the situation escalates into one where a discipline referral for defiance ends up happening. Staff also reported that they feel unprepared to provide prevention intervention at the levels needed by our students or establish strong teacher-student relationships to support positive behaviors. The focus group data as well as survey data indicated that staff have challenges managing student behavior and that it stems from a lack of knowledge about trauma-informed instruction, cultural responsiveness, de-escalation techniques, and social-emotional learning. They also indicated that while they feel and are aware that teacher-student relationships are very important, that they don't always know how to build those relationships, and in fact, especially at the secondary level, that it's sometimes very difficult. Let me go back. Lastly, I just also want to mention that some of them talked about the difficulties related to being walled off from information on understanding, that sometimes other staff in the building understand things about the student that might help them understand, but they don't always have the information come to them, and that teachers might benefit from understanding more about what's happening with the student or the family when others in the school know that. And now I'm on slide 35. And one of the clearer things that came out of all the data that we collected and all the people we spoke to is that there's a lack of openness to dialogue around race. The focus groups in particular with our students, our parents, our principals, and teachers consistently noted that race was a factor in discipline decisions, but also a reluctance to call it out. So I'm just going to pause for a minute and let you read through these quotes to get a flavor of what kinds of things were said to us. And now I'm going to move to another area of challenge for us, which is our student outcomes. FCPS's discipline involves students perform worse academically, and it may be that it even partly explains the achievement gap. So let me discuss what you see on this chart. We took all of our discipline-involved students, and we found a matched comparison group, meaning these students in the prior year had been similar demographically, as well as in terms of how they were doing academically. And then we compared them in the year that half of them were involved in, or some of them were involved in discipline, and the remaining students were not. And what we found were that there were very, very large differences in the percents of these students passing the SOLs. You can see the large gaps between the light blue, which is our discipline-involved students, and the darker blue, which is our other students who were not discipline-involved. And you can also see that for our Hispanic students and our Black students, those gaps are even larger. So when we talked about disproportionality, I mentioned that our Black students are very heavily involved or more likely to be involved in discipline. Our Hispanics are as well, although not quite as much. They were about twice as likely to be involved in discipline. So our student groups that are the most involved in terms of our ethnic racial groups are also the ones that suffer the most or have the biggest gap when they become discipline involved. On this chart as well is our students with disabilities all the way on the right, and you can see a similar pattern that students with disabilities who are involved in discipline are also having far worse performance than students with disabilities who are not. Finally, in terms of challenges in the school division, I'm going to move on to 3 specific things that we kind of lumped under the category of division infrastructure. The first is around centralized collection of discipline-related data. You may recall that back when we came in February to present about the plan and how we would be proceeding with it, Mr. Moon asked us a question about whether we could trace back who was doing the referrals. And the answer was no, we can't, because our discipline data is not clean enough for us to do that. In addition to things like that, we also found that schools really vary in what they do document and what they don't document in the system. And some of our schools are also, as they implement MTSS, finding that what is needed in SIS is not well connected to what they need in order to keep track of the tiered interventions, and they've started to develop their own documentation at the school level. So all 3 of those things indicate that our discipline-related data is not really being handled consistently, and we need to take some steps in order to make it more consistent so that we can understand what's happening throughout the division. A second area in terms of infrastructure is that, in general, staff and schools are not being held accountable for equitable treatment of students, while we are doing some things at the high school level to provide data on an ongoing basis. And while we do have things as part of caring culture that holds the division accountable for it, schools are not being provided with information where they can consistently look at it and take steps at the time to make improvements and make sure that they are doing something to reduce disproportionality. The final area in this section is around stakeholders, that at either the division or school level, we could do a lot more to support their involvement in discipline-related issues. While we do pretty consistently interact with parents and contact parents when their student is discipline involved, the rate that we understand it to be is around 90%. We are not doing as much as we could to help involve them in schools looking at their own data, providing information about what might be behind the causes or solutions to it, and we're also not doing that at the division level consistently. So what should we do to improve? Firstly, it's important that FCPS identify a clear vision of FCPS's discipline approach that reflects the importance of equity, a positive school climate, social emotional learning, and using behavior as an opportunity for student learning. I think this is something that you'll hear repeatedly from some of the other recommendations as well. In terms of revising the SRNR, reflect this broader vision, in the document itself. Make sure to tie the philosophy of consequences to a positive behavior approach, and that will also ultimately require professional development for our staff so they understand the intersection or integration between the positive behavior approach and the punitive things that are currently in the SR&R. And then ensure that the SR&R's continuum of consequences reflect consequences that are appropriate for different ages and abilities. Thirdly, it's important to provide guidance on which behaviors teachers should manage and which should be referred to administrators for consequences. So there's clarity for teachers about how to do things in the classroom that will help reduce discipline referrals, and also when it is important to pass that along to their administrator. And then lastly, in terms of division expectations, adopt a social emotional learning framework or curriculum for all schools to implement so that students themselves can learn to regulate their behavior and become better able to manage their own behavior that currently is leading to some of the discipline referral increases. In terms of implementation of school practices, I've already discussed the need to fully implement MTSS in all our schools. Require inclusion of a school improvement goal for discipline when schools are identified as either having many referrals or disproportionality in their referrals. And then also to reconsider current FCPS practices for sharing of information among school staff so as to better understand and serve students. For professional development, ORCE is recommending 4 separate things. First, in order to confront implicit and explicit biases in staff's own and other staff's thinking and actions, enhance the cultural responsiveness training that staff are receiving. Develop and implement a training for school-based staff and bus drivers on establishing strong and supportive relationships so that they are able to place student behaviors within the context of an understanding of that student's. Provide training for all school-based staff on how to de-escalate behavior situations with students. And similarly, provide professional development for school-based staff about trauma-informed instruction. Then in the last set of recommendations that all have to do with division infrastructure, systematize the recording of discipline-related data across all our schools and incorporate the school-based needs for tracking the tiered interventions that MTSS requires. Expand the caring culture to metrics to include all of our student groups. Then develop an annual monitoring report on discipline disproportionality to ensure we continue to track progress on student outcomes and bias. Ensure all of our schools have an advisory council of staff, parent, and community, and whenever feasible, student representation to support interpreting and responding to school-level discipline and climate data. Our focus groups with our students were very thoughtful, and they are certainly able to help us understand and do things that are in the best interests of providing this positive approach for our students and our families. And then lastly, develop a participatory approach for involving students, parents, and community members in the interpretation and response to division-wide discipline data, especially in relation to Black disproportionality and disproportionality among our students with disabilities, because when we try to understand it and predict it based on the information we had in our data, we weren't able to do that. So it's important to make sure we involve our stakeholders in trying to understand that better. And with that, I will turn it back over to Dr. Duran.
Thank you. As I stated at the outset, unfortunately, Dr. Fergus from Temple University could not be here today due to the change in the date. He did provide us with a report and if you'll notice in the middle of the report, it has like a speaker on it. So if you're interested, it's a very detailed, he went into detail providing a presentation of what his findings were. So I encourage you, if you're very interested in learning a little bit more, you can actually push that little speaker in the middle and it will go through all of his findings. But I will just highlight a few of his recommendations at the very end. Can you go to slide 23 for me? That will be easier than me flipping through. Dr. Fergus basically did 2 things in his study. He reviewed the content of our equity and cultural responsiveness professional development, and then he also reviewed the discipline data and the qualitative and quantitative data that ORCE provided to him with the lens of looking at how are we providing equitable outcomes for students and how are we supporting our staff to make good decisions for students. And so at the end of his report, he basically came out with 4 key recommendations. The first one is really around school practices, as you'll see here, in terms of very similar. And I want to add, and you'll hear in a moment from AIR and Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo, the 3 studies were done independent of one another, and yet you will see very similar recommendations that came about. And that was very, for me, reading them all and getting them all to try and provide an equity plan that I'll share with you at the end. It was really interesting to see the connections, even though they were done very separately. So you'll see here, he also speaks to the vision that's needed around discipline reform, and really how do we articulate well to our community, to our parents, and to our certainly our students and teachers around what we're expecting around positive discipline outcomes and positive discipline practices. He also spoke to the need for a social emotional learning and making sure that we do have some type of implementation of that where he saw it was not existing in our system. Slide 24 was really around strengthening our professional development on cultural responsiveness, and he gave some recommendations on what to do there and how to go deeper. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my equity plan. On slide 25, he focused really on the whole notion of teacher and student relationships and really looking deeper at our practices as it relates to students with disabilities and really suggesting that we probably need to go a little deeper dive than what we have in this study here. This study here, again, was an initial review of what we're seeing around disproportionality, and you heard from Orsi the various subgroups that we definitely see, and you saw the data, but Dr. Fergus suggested that we probably need a closer examination around students with disabilities and understanding a little bit more about what is happening there, and bringing in perhaps another lens on that view. And then on slide 26, his last set of recommendation, his last recommendation was really align what you heard from Leedy as well and Orsi, and that's really how do we support schools to do really root level causes around the analysis of what's happening at individual schools. And he got a lot of that from also thinking about the qualitative data that was received and hearing from staff and from teachers in particular around what is really happening at our school. He did comment on the fact that there was a lot of focus and attention at the division level, but for us, we need to look deeper at individual schools because data at individual schools was very different, as we all know. And so while we've spent a lot of time at the division level doing this, and we still have a lot more to do, we can't forget the notion of what's individual school needs are. And so that's in essence what I did not do a good job of his whole review, but I encourage you to play the presentation. His full report is there, his full presentation is there, and he also is willing, if board members have questions that you send to me, I can get them to him and he will certainly respond in writing to anything you see in his presentation. Understanding today you may not have the chance to go through it here at this table, so as you listen to this later on or go through his presentation later, since he wasn't able to be here, please feel free to send any questions and he will be more than happy to answer those. Our third and final study that we have, and we're fortunate to have Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo here to present their study, and again, their focus was really on discipline and disproportionality again, but looking at policies in particular, our SR&R, as well as looking at some of our practices. And so really excited that they could be here to share a little bit what they found. And it's very timely that we will then be following up this presentation with our discussion around the SR&R, where we can actually make some actionable decisions on what to do to implement some of their recommendations. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo, and they are from the American Institutes for Research. So welcome, and we appreciate them both being here. And just as a little note, both Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo will be here after lunch to answer questions, but they do have to leave at 3 o'clock because they do have another appointment, I believe, in the district. So I'll turn over now to Dr. Osher.
I am fighting a head cold and an infection, so I don't know when I'm talking too loudly or not, and so please help me calibrate, okay? The appointment is to a doctor later. I was out of the country last week, so I want to reinforce the point that Dr. Duran made, both regarding the equity report you'll see soon, which I haven't seen yet, but also in its final form, but Leedy's presentation and Eddie Fergus's presentation, because there really is a very, very important congruence. And I say that as a group that you brought in to give you our independent judgment, not of whether or not there was this congruence, but there is. And at the same time, let me add, as a team of people who work in many districts and study these issues, there was nothing that I heard that was counterintuitive or surprising. The patterns that you heard and are consistent in what we see in other parts of the country, often in places that have less resources than Fairfax, and the issues are higher, but are really consistent. And the types of recommendations that are being made regarding how to move forward, I think, are also consistent. And then just to frame what I will suggest as well is that there are things you ought to do. It's important in terms of equity. I would also suggest that somebody who is particularly concerned with academics, that what you're seeing in the poor academic performance that Leedy's data pointed out is really the tip of an iceberg, because of the fact that the other side of the connection or lack of connection between teachers and students that in part lead to the endeavors you're seeing is lots of things that mean that students are underengaged and are losing some opportunities to learn. And so that if you can really address this, you will also be transforming outcomes, hopefully for these young people, but other research would suggest for other young people as well, because there are actually collateral consequences that happen for the kids who are not necessarily the ones who ended up in the 7% or the 3%. Okay, with that, let me now move forward. I won't go through the agenda. In fact, I'm going to go through only some of the slides so that we can really leave you as much time as possible. We did an analysis that's based on a framework that is very, very consistent with multi-tiered systems of support. I'm pulling this up, though, because of the fact that in the way in which we do our work and we recommend it, we think it's very important to see Tier 1 as your foundation. And everything is built upon it. And so if you have a strong foundation at Tier 1, there are going to be less students who need early interventions and less students who need more intensive interventions. And in addition, if you have a firm foundation, that foundation is also going to mean that your early interventions, Tier 2, and your intensive interventions, Tier 3, are going to be more likely to work, because of the fact that the real environment in which young people are developing is the entire school environment. It's not just the place where they may be receiving a particular point of support. And one other point about the framework is each school is different. So that while on the one hand there are lots of things that you ought to be thinking about doing at a district level, and we'll be making some findings and recommendations in regard to that, at the same time, not only the root cause planning that Dr. Fergus was recommending, but really deciding what is the necessary foundation is something that has to be done ideally at a school level, because the makeup of the student body is different. And in a county the size of Fairfax, that may be particularly the case, but when I do work in New York City or Cleveland, it's no different. Every school is different. And when I do work in rural Alaska, it's no different. Every school is different. Here are the overarching key findings. On the one hand, as you've already heard, Fairfax has implemented some systemic evidence and research-based multi-tiered social, emotional, and behavioral preventions, interventions, and supports. And they are of the sort that you would want to have in place if you're going to be doing a job that reduces some of the problems you're facing. At the same time, they have neither been implemented and adapted at scale. And because MTSS is actually a framework for combining interventions, What is also important is the fact that there is a lack of lists of or menus of interventions that schools can adapt, which then means that schools are not getting the type of support that they could get if there was a more focused list. That does not mean you have a menu where you just have one choice. But it does mean that you want to have an array of interventions that could be focused upon and supported by the district in the staff training and in other supports the district can do, and also that can better support peer learning among schools, both the staff and administrators. Tier 2 and 3 supports appear to be stronger and more systemic than Tier 1. So to go back to that earlier point I made, if the real savings is having a strong foundation, then what happens is right now you're stronger in terms of addressing problems than you are in terms of preventing the problems. Not untypical, okay? Right? But you know, remember that old adage, pay us now or pay us later? And what happens is you tend to pay later because you know that the car has a problem. What you want to do is to be able to anticipate so you don't have to pay later. And particularly because when you're paying later, it already means that young people have been learning about themselves as children who are having problems in school and maybe had not seen themselves as learners. So the earlier you can intervene with that foundation, the better off you are. And lastly, site-level data-driven decision-making structures and processes are not systemic. More overarching key finding, more targeted attention could be paid to deeper support for regions, pyramids, schools with higher discipline referral and suspension rates and the subgroups they serve. And I would add here, having heard the previous presentations, that if you had a better data system that was giving you that consistent data from an MTSS framework across the district, it would be easier for you to make those allocations. And let me add here, there's an equity issue here because of the fact that to the extent that if I'm a student in one place, I'm getting a service I need because the principal wants me to have services, but in another school, I may not because the principal does not see this type of service as being relevant, then there's an actual equity issue that's not coming up here in terms of the statistics, but it's also who's getting the services and who's not getting the services that as a board you're providing. Attention should specifically focus on initiatives that increase students' individual and collective sense of being connected and being emotionally and physically safe and at the same time challenged and accountable. And safety is not just physical safety. Thank you. Safety is not just physical safety. It's also emotional safety. It's also identity safety. And together, that's the type of safety that is a fundamental condition for learning that actually can drive the deeper learning that you want to have happen in the district. Most sections of the students' rights and responsibilities that we reviewed are good. Okay, so now strengths and assets. We looked at the documents and compared to documents that we've seen in many places. These are quite good in terms of their user-friendliness, in their organization, in sufficiently describing the 3 levels of behavioral infractions, and providing a separate section devoted to discipline procedures for students with disabilities, and in articulating the concern, complaints, and appeal processes. So you have a document that works. We'll come back to how it could be improved later, okay? If we look at the multi-tiered systems of support, you have now in place a set of interventions that people in the field would say are a good array. Using positive behavioral approaches, using particularly a positive intervention and behavioral system approach, PBIS, using the responsive classroom, which is a very good SEL program that is also building community amongst students within a classroom and between teachers and students is a good one. And starting to use restorative justice for individuals and small groups of students. And restorative justice can be important both because of the fact that it can reduce the types of sanctions that are made, but if restorative justice is done well, it's providing young people with an opportunity to learn something. And that's probably the most important part of restorative justice, is the learning part. At Tier 2, there's an array of social, emotional, and behavioral supports and evidence-based interventions and counseling services and SEL activities with small groups of students, as well as restorative justice. And at Tier 3, you also have behavior intervention services teams, plans, and the Achievement, Integrity, and Maturity Program, and the Alternative Learning Centers, and crisis intervention services, and psychology and social work supports for individuals and groups of students. It's the type of array you would want to have if it's done well. I want to again point out here the point that you heard in other reports, that this work has to be done in a trauma-informed manner, that this work has to be done in a culturally responsive manner, that this work has to be done in a way that young people and families see as being connected to their aspirations, is all important. And that's not what we were looking at. We were looking at the array rather than whether or not it's done in that high quality manner. Challenges and areas for future for improvement. As you've heard, it's one thing to have a vision, it's another thing for that vision to be experienced as coherent by people out in the schools and by all your stakeholders, and that is not the case right now. The current protocols don't go beyond running a list of potential or typical interventions and consequences, and that means that people may choose from that list, but are not necessarily choosing what may work best for a particular student or a particular student in a particular school. And there is a need for better alignment and descriptions of multi-tiered social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health supports with the leveled consequences in the current programs. And so you have, on the one hand, supports that are being provided. You also have an array of consequences that build up when students are in trouble. There is not a clear alignment between them. Policy. There's a high level of subjectivity in decisions that are being made, both by teachers and by administrators. As you've heard from Leedy, the problem may be more at the teacher level and may in part be related to issues like implicit bias that are being addressed, because you really see them in those subjective offenses. And I think the data you saw there between the objective and subjective offenses is not untypical of what we see. But at the same time, there is still a latitude which you may not be picking up right now that we would recommend, because of the fact that an administrator can choose between 1 and up to 10 days. And while right now we have no evidence from solid research what is the consequences of more than 1 day of suspensions, I'll outline some of them right now and tell you that in New York City we're doing that analysis right now, and so we will be able to start judging. But every day a student is suspended is a day that that student is out of school. And if you just look at what we know from, for example, for young children about chronic absenteeism, one element of chronic absenteeism ends up being days lost to suspension. And so when an administrator has the ability to choose, that may mean that if he does choose to suspend, they may choose to suspend for more days than it may be necessary. The language related to contacting and meeting with parents in a timely manner is not strong enough. And the current policy, while the current policy in many ways is good regarding articulating the needs of students with disabilities. The current policy lacks consideration of the FAPE implications of suspension decisions that may be actually changes in placement and may actually be manifestation issues as well. And so that has to be addressed. Recommendations, I'm now going to go, I'm going to go to our NSIP series of recommendations. So Rob, would you move down to there, please? And then to explain the fact that the recommendations we are making are presented in what we think you want to do in year 1, year 2, and year 3. And it's based on work that AIR has done for many years, both studying systemic reform and studying implementation science, but also the work we do in districts in terms of trying to help districts turn things around. And basically, what we know is that if you really want to be able to address root causes and develop sustainable solutions, you have to build on what you're doing to a point where people are executing with sufficient quality. And we hope that our recommendations are consistent with that. And Rob, do you want to now take us through these?
Sure.
Okay.
I'll quickly go through the policy recommendations, many of which you've heard already, or a lot of alignment there. The first one gets to really currently articulating or better articulating your current vision. So we're clear with direction that the district is going in, and the policy could likewise be stronger in articulating that current philosophy, vision, and mission and beliefs. Be explicit about that necessity of school, student, family, home congruence, and what the district is doing around building those relationships both within schools and outside of schools that as it relates to climate, culture, and discipline. And clearly articulate that, again, out-of-school suspension should be last resorts and issued in ranges with small increments. So we give some examples there of if the vision is to start within school, if you have to, exclude students, start within school and in small increments. And then if you have to, or if the situation seems to merit that, then then get into out-of-school suspension in very small increments if that is deemed to be a necessity at that time. As David has shared, that the research is very clear that we haven't seen any benefits from kids being out of school unless it's absolutely necessary. Again, better define and provide high quality trainings on the more subjective infractions. So that could, again, what we didn't hear a little earlier was, it seems like it was more disparity or disproportionality in the referrals, but not as much with the suspensions. But another piece to perhaps look at later would be the length of suspensions for the more subjective infractions. Again, as David mentioned, you want to expand the array or the toolbox, if you will, that students and educators and administrators have. And again, better align those with those leveled infractions and better describe what's going on already. So in other words, we heard through other data sources some of the wonderful things that are going on support-wise, but they weren't fully articulated or explained within the policy. We're talking about it being user-friendly to families and students to know what types of supports are available, and also to create a little more balance with the document as it currently stands. And we talk, as far as PBA, there may be other opportunities around incentives. Adults need incentives, so obviously kids need incentives. So as you look at some of the more or the stronger PBA or PBIS approaches, have a pretty strong focus on incentives and minimizes the over-reliance on disincentives, if you will, or exclusionary discipline. And there are creative ways to do that. If you look at your data, you know when the behaviors peak up. And most administrators or teachers know their schools, and so you want to align the incentives there and also incentivize your kids who are trying very hard to turn the corner. May not be perfect yet, but to recognize them, because to the adolescent mind, they could say, I got more attention when I was acting up. So you don't want to miss those opportunities. Continue to put limits and clarify the roles of the school resource officers. We saw recent changes were in this direction, so we just wanted to really acknowledge that and encourage you to continue that. And again, this gets around the due diligence of reaching out to parents. You know, in some areas, the language was a little loose in the way of we understand the difficulties of in the moment reaching parents, but you want to make sure that you have documented efforts, timely efforts to notify parents first and foremost through multiple mediums, and also trying to make sure that you have those conversations with them. Sometimes these activities are delayed legitimately because of parent schedules and their accessibility or availability, but you really want to try to, even if it's a call, have these conversations and not let this interaction around discipline be highly dependent upon, say, the parent's agency as it relates to these issues. The due diligence, and again, and the burden or the challenge, if you will, is on the school to do that. And again, we talk about something as simple as you just making sure you had 3, and we say urgent or timely attempts through different mediums to reach that parent and document those, and again, try to close those gaps, particularly when more serious issues are at hand. Year 1 and 2 recommendations with students with differing abilities. We suggest that you formally address these key questions when working with students with differing abilities. And you did a very, very solid job, I think, of articulating or trying to gather whether or not it was a manifestation of a student's disability and whether or not the IEP is up to date or needs to be updated, or if it was poor implementation. But this key piece here, in considering whether or not it's a change of placement. So the key questions are, you know, per the law, has the student's placement been changed due to cumulative number of days out, due to suspensions that, number one, are in proximity to one another and related to a pattern of similar behaviors? You know, in the light of the behaviors at hand, does the SPED team need to conduct an updated evaluation or updated evaluations and update the student's IEP goals and services? And we suggest that, similar to the kind of a decision-making tree that we mentioned earlier, to provide a separate one when students with disabilities are involved or with differing abilities to help parents navigate that process. But this is an important 4th question we would ask on top of the other 3 that you seem to have a handle on, that we strongly consider you put in place and squarely implement on a consistent basis. Again, fully articulate your current vision and aspiration for building students' social, emotional, and behavioral competencies. We hear these things through different ways, but that needs to be out there front and center to reflect your current direction. This one gets into the nitty-gritty here. We're talking about revisiting and redefining the definitions of short and long-term suspensions. And we had this as a year 2 suggested activity. And we're talking about, really, instead of thinking of short-term being up to 10 days, the short-term being 1 to 5 days. And again, we've all taken vacations or been out sick. Missing more than 1 day of anything is pretty serious. If you're providing quality instruction, which we're sure you are, just think about the gravity of a student missing 5 or 5+ days. You know, then perhaps redefining long-term as 5+ days that has gets to the level of scrutiny that 10+ day suspensions currently get. Again, we talked about restructuring the standards of conduct for students, where the levels of interventional consequences chart to separate. And I think that the committee of the team is already working on this. Again, right now, page 20, I believe it is. It's a shame that I know that. For the level A and B and C infractions, currently is a running list or a bit of a hodgepodge, if you will, of interventions and consequences. So we're thinking about improving that to a separate flow chart of progressive, continuum, if you will, of the supports. Be clear what you're going to do to support the student. And number 2, what the potential and hopefully minimally exclusionary potential consequences are in that order. So that kind of provides that guidance that it seems like your educators were yearning for in kind of laying out that progression, if you will, in a minimally exclusionary fashion. we keep going? And for preventions and interventions integration, again, continue to expand that menu. And we already said that, and really fully articulate what currently is in place and what direction you're going in. And similarly, you're going to hear a little later around the related training. So as much as you can integrate these ideals of being restorative and trauma-informed, or trauma-responsive, and culturally competent, and these things, as much as you can integrate them into the trainings, into your practices, into your true culture, meaning climate is kind of how you feel about your school and your peers and your community, but that culture is, as one researcher put it, is how we be, how we engage with one another. So as much as you can integrate those things and articulate them, the better. And we talked about the incentive. Did I go back a slide? We talked about some of the challenges with the actual preventions, interventions, and supports. We talked about the autonomy and site level. Tier 1 can lead to misalignment with the district's capacity to support. So that's major. So in other words, if there's something gets hot in the field and folks jump on the next hot train around programming, and the training and the capacity of the central office is over here, then that leads to disconnect, and that doesn't guarantee that actually that those interventions and supports have been vetted. You know, in other words, they may not be of high quality. So consistent with what we heard earlier, to identify a short list of 2 to 3 and then coalesce around those would be great. Again, we talked about generating buy-in and engaged regions and school systems and district-wide initiatives. That could be a little stronger, and both of those things are very, very tied. We talked about MTSS as being in the early stage of implementation. We talked about the Tier 1 implementation. There's focus on relationships. Relationships, relationships, relationships. As student-student, student-teacher, educator-family, educator-educator, that sets the tone for your climate and culture, and it doesn't just happen. You know, it doesn't just happen. So as much, you know, it sounds like a no-brainer, but explicit attention needs to be paid to that, and it also gets into, which we don't get a lot into, which the adult self-care as well. We're in the helping professions. It can wear you down, and you going back to those incentives and those positive things that applies to teachers and educators, staff, period, from instructional specialists or aides on down security and cafeteria. We have to lift each other up along the way as well, and formally celebrating successes. Again, we talked about the site level data-driven structures that's been acknowledged in both reports, and perhaps there's need to double down and revisit the PBA implementation at the middle and high school levels. And again, that's not unusual for the field. You know, it's much more concrete for the early childhood and elementary years. It gets a little murkier or more murky at the middle school years, and the high school. It'll look a little different because we have different expectations of them the older they get as well. Recommendations around year 1, human resources and capacity building. And this is, again, a consistent piece around, I think, the 3 reports, and assess the readiness of schools and school staff to implement the desired practices and programs. In other words, there are varying degrees of readiness and varying types of concerns and levels of concern. And instead of hoping that we address them through our professional development and capacity building, it's a good idea to assess those and tailor your approach and messaging moving forward. We talked about a short, mid, long-term professional development plan, which I understand is forthcoming, and providing more targeted supports and resources to the pyramids, to the pyramid schools and regions exhibiting higher levels of disciplinary infractions. Again, no one size fits all, and perhaps there could be some adjustments in the allocation of counselors per se, or your behavioral intervention teachers and the like to better support those places. And continue to deepen cultural and linguistic competence and responsiveness, including implicit bias training. So you have a lot of good inputs and have gotten out the blocks there. David?
All right. And to continue to enhance the social and emotional wellness and skills of school staff. When you're talking about social emotional learning, our best knowledge of social emotional learning is not just teaching young people skills, but rather how adults model the type of skills that you want. And in fact, Dr. Fergus has a really important article that he wrote with Ann Gregory in The Futures of Children that actually flips the issue of the typical SEL competencies from students to say, what do you want of teachers? You know, how do teachers learn to stop and think and before they do something that might lead to a disciplinary infraction, for example. Year 2, provide more integrated professional development. The main point here is, I think, you don't just want to have good PD. You want people to see the connections between and among the different pieces of professional development and see how they can apply that in their own work. Continue to provide more targeted supports and resources, particular pyramids and schools that your data are showing have greater needs, and continue to deepen the cultural and linguistic competence and responsiveness and trauma-sensitive school practices of the school staff. This is really about changing people's mental mindsets and behaviors. You need to keep on building this if it's going to happen. People do not change overnight, even if they are well-intended, because they're fighting lessons that they've learned as they've been socialized in our society. Next slide. Okay. In year 2, strategize on how to improve the ratios of students to counselors, particularly in elementary schools, and most particularly in particular pyramids of schools. Continue to do the work on social emotional wellness and of school staff, and revisit and redefine the role of the system support advisors, and consider establishing a professional learning community for SOSAs and other support staff who are directly involved in student discipline. Next slide. And in year 3, continue to provide the integrated preventative development, continue to provide the more targeted supports, continue to enhance social emotional wellness, and to continue to revisit and redefine the system of support advisors. And again, I'm running out of my voice, so I need you to quickly, and I apologize for this, but I cannot.
Okay, and then again, for the district-wide supports, our buckets, we've mentioned that in year 1, assess and build readiness, develop short, mid-range, and long-range plan, and collaboratively vet and select that short list of SEL programming and relationship and community building activities with a particular focus on tier 1s, and perhaps deepening the intervention and wraparound programs. So it gets readiness rolling out the PD. We suggest that you train your internal leaders and to build internal capacity with CBAM. That's a concerns-based adoption model, a tool that's been used in a number of places to assess readiness, the level of concerns and the types of concerns to better tailor and target your professional development. Again, continue the other activities that we mentioned before, and particularly around the delivery of intervention prevention programs that account for the frequency and intensity of support needed. So that gets into kind of the dosage and duration, if you will, of intervention. So that goes back to being very data-driven, being very reflective in what's worked well and why and how and what implication it is for targeted supports for kids and for educators. And integrate the SEL into the scope and sequence. This is a major one. A lot of folks miss the opportunity to, it's a low-hanging fruit. If you're a literature-rich district like you are, then English language arts and social studies is a clear place where SEL-related topics come up around relationships, friendships, winners, losers, victims, victimizers, and the like. So to just basically let your educators have at it and integrate those self-regulation and self-awareness and relationships and the like into the scope and sequence over time. Again, we suggest with the multi-tier systems of support real quickly to establish a consistent structure and process for school-based teams for analyzing and responding to their data. We heard a number of different bodies at the site level that this could take place. It sounds like it was going on, but given the fact that 6 or 7 potential bodies were mentioned, that means it likely could or could not be going on in a high-quality fashion or in a data-driven fashion. So let's help the schools with those processes. And again, develop a formal process to improve data collection, use, reporting, and monitoring for implementation fidelity. And we're talking about basically a district level process or exercise where you're looking at site level data on up to pyramid level data, and aligning these to the full extent possible with the school innovation improvement plan goals. Just almost in the home run now. With the multi-tier systems of support, look to an early warning system and periodically screen for early warning signs. So this is these can be very fancy ones, or these could be Excel documents that are color-coded yellow, red, and green on key indicators such as attendance, tardiness, classroom referrals or classroom issues, office referrals, and the like, to help educators be more nimble in their decision-making and allocation of supports and interventions. We talked about continuing to implement those site-level bodies, continuing to improve basically the district-level accountability around these things. And when we say accountability, we mean a way to celebrate successes and identify, let's say, yellow flags and red flags and deploy supports. And consider gathering more qualitative data or variables that are associated with inequitable district practice. And that gets into shifts in staff values, mindsets, and actions. Family and youth engagement, we talked about that. Fully integrate school climate, culture, and discipline into existing family and youth relationship building, engagement, and communication collaboration activities. In other words, as much attention as you pay to collaboration around academics, it could be paid to issues around climate and culture and the related goals, and identify, address potential cultural factors that may be impacting family agency or understanding of policies and practices. So your policies were very user-friendly. However, we know that all parents and all families aren't as comfortable with engaging with schools and may not feel that sense of agency. And let's not leave that up to chance or to that family's disposition, and build those collaborative relationships so that if and when issues come about, you have that foundation to discuss and strategize, collaborate around issues related to discipline. And continue these activities basically moving forward for year 2 and 3. Whew.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Yeah.
So as you've heard, we've had 3 really, really strong reports that, again, I want to reiterate for the purpose of really understanding that all 3 of these were done independently. And as you sit and listen to each of them and saw the data, I'm sure that you, just like me, were, when I was reading them independently, connecting the dots and seeing a strong congruence around some of the things that we can, must, and should do to support our students. So part of the charge with regards to this study was to, again, have the 2 external studies, our internal study, and then come up with what's a plan of action that we can begin to do, not finish. You saw, and I most appreciated Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo, thank you for presenting year 1, year 2, and 3, because there's a lot to do. And what I appreciated was your ability to help us think about how to scaffold appropriately to get to where we want to go if we're really going to impact the positive changes we would like to do. So you all have, if we can, has it pulled up? Okay, I cannot use this, right? You have to follow the, I can't use this for this, okay. So you'll have to scroll down for me. So what I'd like to share now is quickly our equity plan for discipline, policy, and practices. And after reading and listening and thinking about all of the recommendations and the findings and some of the current work we're doing, I want to present to you some of the things that I believe we should be considering to do and some actions that we need to be taking in order to make sure that we're ultimately going to achieve what we want, and that is equitable outcomes for students with regards to discipline. So you'll see here that the plan is outlined in 4 different ways. If you can scroll down a little bit, right there. So we really want to think about how do we take ourselves from where we've been currently, which is around assessment and awareness, and we're getting a lot more awareness and assessment today in these 2 reports. But if we become more aware and begin to assess and start to understand our data but don't act on it, then we're ultimately not doing what we need to do to support students. So the next stage for us in this work is really how do we begin to align all of our policies, practices to support the approach of moving from punitive consequences to discipline as a learning opportunity. So if you'll see under the alignment bucket there, under the green bucket, there are 4 main things that I'm going to outline: professional development, policies, school practices, resources, and budget. And there are a few key recommendations for us to move forward. So if you'll scroll down to the first one, which is professional development and training, and there are 8 key actions that I believe that we can immediately begin to take and should begin to take as it relates to the information we've received from our studies. So as you heard from all 3 studies, we need to continue to our cultural responsiveness training for next year, but we need to enhance it, and we need to take it to another level. And so, as many of you are aware, we've been doing cultural responsive training for a couple of years now in the form of a one module. And we started out with that module being an online module, to this year having the entire system engage in a day of learning, an afternoon of learning, and all school staff came together. In our equity plan moving forward, we're proposing that we would have that module be twice a year, one in the fall and one in the spring, and that we would really focus the module around 4 key areas that we heard today from our presenters and that we know we need to do to move forward. We need to help all staff have an overview and introduction to discipline disproportionality research, really understanding what that means. You heard a lot of it today, and if we're going to begin to help support this effort, we need to understand more. What does that look like? We heard from all 3 reports the need to look at bias, so implicit and explicit bias. We heard from all 3 the need to have culturally responsive classroom management practices, that we're looking at supporting students and families, and we heard a lot of this from our teacher qualitative reports, as you heard from Orsi, where a lot of teachers were asking for this. And the last thing is that whole piece around school-family collaboration and how do we better build relationships with parents, with student to student, with teacher to teacher, et cetera. Number 2 is that for professional development, that when schools have been identified as having high levels of referrals or disproportionality, we now are fortunate to have next year an equity and student code of conduct, who's actually here in the back, Carrie Williams. If you want to just raise your hand, you'll see who she is. She doesn't start officially till July 1 in that role, but she will be helping us to assist and really think about how we can support those schools in making sure that they have a school improvement goal around discipline. You heard from all 3 studies as well, where schools need to do a deeper dive, a root level cause analysis, and then have an actual goal in their school improvement plan as it relates to that. The third for training is we want to make sure that we're fortunate in partnering with the county, that they're going to be able to offer this to all of our teachers and school-based administrators, the Cognito Trauma-Informed Practices for K-12, and that's the actual title of it, and it's essentially an online, it's about a 40-minute online, or 20-minute online training. It's very introductory in the awareness piece around helping parents and students and staff and teachers understand the whole trauma approach. And so in meeting with our PTA representatives and looking at this plan, they asked, could this be available to parents? And it will be available to them. So all teachers and all school-based administrators by December will have this training. We also want to make sure in our professional development that all schools have a team who will receive professional development about trauma-informed decisions and strategies, and we heard that from all 3 of our studies as well. And we're going to begin to do that in 2019-20 with all Title I schools completing that training. And then over the next 3 years, we will have a phased-in approach, and that phased-in approach beyond Title I schools will be related to the schools with the data that show the need for having a team that is trained centrally by us to understand trauma-informed practices. Number 5, and when we think about professional development and learning, and we're fortunate that we're going to now have, with the addition of new BITs or behavior intervention teachers, we want to make sure that we're targeting those to school staff and to schools where we see the data as a need. They're going to be providing professional development on the crisis cycle and on the de-escalation strategies. And so really thinking about that in terms of a very intentional, strategic way, somewhat similar to how we use our Project Momentum model, where we look at the data and see which schools need that support. This position would be able to go into those schools now that we'll have more of the capacity to do that. Number 6, we heard from 2 of the reports, in particular, Dr. Fergus and our Orsi report, around the need to have deeper conversations around what's occurring as regards to some of the racial disparities we see. So how do we help provide professional development to our equity leads on how to look at that data and have those kinds of conversations? Number 7 is the DSS, a Department of Special Services, will be able to provide 10 school-based staff, 2 per each region, turnaround restorative justice training to continue to expand our restorative justice work. So expanding that and making sure that we have 2 more people, at least per region, that will do that. Again, this is our year 1 goal. We definitely want to have more and more than that, but as we're thinking what we can do capacity-wise and what we know we need to do. And the last thing is our Summer Equity Symposium. We've had a Summer Equity Symposium previously. This year we want to focus that, and it's going to be on student voice. We heard a lot through all 3 of our reports, the need to have that student-teacher relationship there. And so we're going to focus on student voice, and the focus for that, for all of our school teams who will be coming to the symposium, is how to build positive relationships. The second area, which is our policies, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this for number 1 because that's our next topic this afternoon, but certainly that we do have some recommended changes in the 2019-20 SR&R that you will see from us later today that we strongly, to the equity plan, think need to be put in place. And I won't read all those to you, but they're there because we're actually going to review them in our next presentation. But beyond that, we need a continued revision, as Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo talked about, year 2, and this is item 1B. We need to continue to revise the SR&R beyond what we're going to present you today to really integrate more positive behavior approaches. Even in the Orsi report, we heard there were 2 sentences or 2 lines that only spoke to positive behavior, and really the majority of it in their report was around punitive measures. And so how do we shift our culture around that? It needs to also be in our regulation if we're going to expect positive outcomes from that. And also that we heard also from Dr. Mayo and Dr. Osher the need in our next revision to have a real clear flow chart for students with disabilities that's separate. We do have a section for that, but we need a very clear, more defined way for teachers and staff to understand how do you understand and support students with disabilities. As we saw in the Orsi report, they are 3.5 times more likely to be engaged in a discipline-related incident. So we need to be more clear on how we support that work. And also in our next revision that our SR&R is aligned more with our multi-tier system of support framework that we would like to see in terms of the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. We won't see that in this year's revision, but you'll see elements where we're touching that, but it really needs a total restructuring, I think is the word that Dr. Mayo used when he gave his presentation. Another very important thing about policies, if we're going to really understand student voice, and I think student voice is critical, we need to develop additional youth survey questions that address perceptions of school climate and discipline. We often refer to our youth survey in terms of even our strategic plan report, but we don't have specific questions where we're generating from students their response around that. So we really need to do that in working with the county. That's connected to number 3, and that if we're going to do that, we need to have a better way to disaggregate. We currently cannot disaggregate youth survey by student demographics because it's not captured that way. So in particular, if we want to look at youth survey data and understand how students with disabilities are answering versus students in poverty, we're not able to do that currently. So moving forward, we need to find a way to be able to do that, and also by school, because currently we do have that by pyramid, but not necessarily by school. So if we really want to get the type of data and begin to understand what some of the stuff you heard in the previous presentations, we don't have that currently to look at with regards to student voice, which is number 2 and 3. Number 4, we have an equity stakeholder group that has begun to meet this year, and they've met quarterly, and they've begun to really look about that group has been, as you remember last year when I came before the school board with our equity plan, we put in place equity stakeholder as a measure to make sure that the equity plan was being instituted, and that was asked by this board to make sure that that was put in place. So we put that in place, but it's really been up to this point really about what the board asked us to do, which was monitor and implement the implementation of our equity resources, which I understand we're going to be coming probably in September to provide a report from that group, but to shift that group to not just implementation of the plan, to also really begin to use that group to look at data and discipline data and include their voice and their perspective in that discussion, as opposed to just overall implementation of our resources. And then the last thing, which I think is a really, really important one, you just heard on last week our Goal 2 presentation by Ms. Johnson, and today, at the end of the day, we're going to have our Goal 2 report. We do not have a disproportionality monitoring report as part of strategic plan goal 2. And we need to work with ORSI to develop a way to capture something that yearly and annually we can present to the school board and the community on how we're doing with regards to disproportionality. We were fortunate to have outside consultants and ORSI do an extensive dive today and present you that information, but that should be an annual constant review by the board, by the community, and by staff, and I believe that should be part of our goal 2 report as a metric. We don't currently have it as one, so that's my recommendation, that it would be part of the goal 2. The third area is school practices, and there are 7. One is that we must ensure, working with our regional assistant superintendents, that each school has a team that's in place to review school climate and discipline data. Ultimately, we would love to see the team be our equity team, and we've been developing that through our equity resources and the equity leads that this board has supported. But right now, not every school has a well-functioning equity team. We're building that up. So eventually, we would want to see the equity team as the team doing this. But in the interim, we're saying a team, whether it's the wellness committee, the PTA, PTO, or another established school team. Next year, every school needs to have a team reviewing climate and discipline data. If you recall, both Dr. Osher, Mayo, and the ORSI report spoke to the need to do a root level cause analysis of what is happening at the individual school. And that can best be done and should best be done by individuals at the school who are telling us what we need to know about and what they see needs to happen with regards to discipline at their school. The second is that each school will be conducting an MTSS self-assessment this fall, and working with our regional superintendents, we'll develop a plan of what's needed for implementation next year to really begin to do what number 3 speaks to, and that's have a full MTSS framework implemented in all schools by 2021. You heard that as well from 2 of our presenters today. The fourth one is consistently document, and the key word here is consistently. Document disciplinary infractions. We do not have a universal online referral form, but you'll see in my resources section that that's something that I'm recommending that we begin to work on. And in fact, just last week, we've already begun to work with Mary Beth Loveklass and her team on how we can have a universal online form put in place so that at the system level, at the school level, pyramid level, region level, we can begin to disaggregate and look at our teacher level referrals, out of school suspensions, and in school suspensions. As you heard from in the ORSI report, they were not able to analyze that because we don't have that type of data available. Number 5, using the equity audit, which is a tool that is being presented and taught to our equity leads and our principals. It is a key set of questions that look at relationships, instruction, and the environment, and understanding how schools are doing in those 3 areas, making sure that we have that done by each and every school so we can analyze and understand the needs of every school. And in the cases where there are needs, that schools are writing a SIP goal which support a caring culture and closing the achievement gap driver that's appropriate for their school. And then the last thing, something very excited about, I was down in Henrico County visiting one of their schools, and some students were giving me a tour, and I asked who they were, and they told me they were the equity ambassadors. And Henrico County has developed what we've done and taken it further. We have an equity lead, which is a staff person, but they actually have identified students who are equity ambassadors for their schools who receive training and support around looking at the student voice, bringing it into their school. So we want to look at that. A team of ours has actually went down to Henrico County to see what they've been doing, and we want to bring back to our system a form of student equity ambassadors that we would potentially see in spring of 2020. The last area is for our resources and budget in order to do this work. Number 1 and 2 are really that we continue the current funding that this board has committed to around our equity plan and our family engagement survey. So continuing that work in our budget, maintaining that there. Number 3 is one-time funding, and we don't know what that is. Mary Beth Loveklass and her team are looking at what that might look like, so we would have to bring that back to you. But one-time funding for what it would take to create an online discipline referral form and the data tools that we do need if we're going to have system-wide view of discipline data that goes beyond out-of-school suspensions. If we want to look at what that is, school by school, classroom by classroom, we need to have some systemic way to do that. Number 4 is on consideration. Number 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are all considerations for the board. Not, again, as I stated at the beginning of this work session, not decisions to make today, but decisions we would need to move forward with. Consideration for future funding to issue an RFP that would help us to secure 2 social emotional learning programs to implement for the following year. You heard from all 3 reports. Well, you didn't hear from Dr. Ferg's report, but if you look into it, you will see that having SEL programs are critical, are important. We do have some, but we don't have district-wide SEL programs, so it's difficult to support their implementation. And many school systems who have done this well, we've heard from Dr. Osher and Dr. Mayo, have a district-wide, a couple of them for schools to choose, age-appropriate, of course. And so with the system our size, we can't just identify them like some smaller systems have. We obviously would have to have an RFP. And then number 5 is future funding for substance abuse prevention specialists per pyramid. If we want to really do some of the work we're going to talk about in the SRNR, which you will be talking about later this afternoon, we really need to think about expanding what that looks like. We, as you know, last year, the county provided us 6 positions. But we would like to see that we have 1 per pyramid, and so we thought of a way to potentially, and this is all for consideration, have a phased-in approach for next year, 7 additional, and then the following year with 6, and then we would have 1 per pyramid to do that. Number 6 is making sure we have funding to access the interpreter line for parent notification. We will see in the SRNR ways to enhance and strengthen parent notification. We see also from Dr. Mayo and Dr. Osher's report that parent notification is critical in terms of discipline matters. And we do have funding currently for parent notification lines, but not sufficient if we're going to ask schools to make sure that they're reaching out to parents when their child is involved in a disciplinary infraction. They may not speak the language of the parent they're reaching out to. And so we have a system in place, so it's not creating a system. We've established one through an RFP and whatnot. It's just needing additional funds because that system is based upon a charge per usage. So if we really want schools to use it, we're going to need to make sure we have some money for that. Number 7 is consideration, potentially, and this is all conversations that would need to happen with the board level, about potentially having a SOSA at the middle school level, and then having some type of a plan for additional staffing for elementary schools. So as we thought about, and you heard some really great feedback from our presenters today, it won't just happen without some resources and some things being put in place. And so here's the 8 high-level ones that I thought were really important for us to consider and have future conversations about. With that, Mr. Moon, we only went over 5 minutes.
Thank you, I really
And
appreciate
we
that.
kept it to an hour and a half, hour and 35 minutes, so thank you.
I'll take responsibility for the 5 we went over.
Thank you, thank you. For those school board members who were not at the beginning of the work session this morning, what he did was that basically, with the Dr. Duran's lead, that we went over all 4 different reports, presentations first, just holding up all the questions until we take a lunch break and come back for another 2 hours. So with that, Madam Chair, you have a closed meeting motion.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Vice Chair Moon. Okay. The board will now make a motion to go into closed meeting to consult with legal counsel pertaining to litigation pending in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia under this style John Doe v. School Board Civil Action Number 119 CV 00065, where such consultation in open meeting would adversely affect the litigating posture of the school board pursuant to Section 2.2, 3711A7 of the Code of Virginia. Do I have a motion? Motion made by Mr. Moon, seconded by Ms. Derenak Kofax. All those in favor? And that is unanimous with Ms. Hines not here.
Okay, board will come back to
And we're
the
now in close. Oh, and Mr. McElveen. And so we are now in closed session.